This is the ninth game coming up, and the first one where white does not start with the king pawn. It's played with black by world champion Caro Lasker before he became world champion. It's a rare occurrence in his career to lose such a short game, as we'll see now.
White starts with knight to f3.
This is a decent developing move, controlling two center squares, although it does not put any pawn in the center, but white can do that in the following move.
Black responds with d5.
This is one of the good responses. Another one would be, for example, developing the knight to f6 instead.
d4.
Now we're back to a queen pawn opening with this move.
Black developed the bishop with bishop to f5.
This is a somewhat rare variation, side variation, I would say. It's more customary to develop the king side first, and I would recommend it more.
White continues with c4.
This is a temporary pawn sacrifice that, even if black captures the pawn, cannot keep it for very long. For example, white can just give a check, fork, and get the pawn back right away, or white could even simply play e3 and get the pawn back later.
Black continues with c6.
Black protects the pawn on d5 another time.
Queen to b3.
Now this move through gets the queen out early. However, the idea is to take advantage of black's early development of that bishop and leaving the b7 pawn on an unprotected square. So this specific move in this position is a good idea for white.
Queen to c8.
Black protected the pawn on b7. I'd like to show you, before we continue with that, another move that leads to a very cute variation. Queen b6. The idea is also to save the pawn on b7. This offers a trade of queens, where it's true that black would, let's say, double up the pawns after queen takes, pawn takes, but the rook opens up, and it has been shown in a number of games that it's not bad for black in this case. Now white plays pawn takes pawn. Now if black would just take back, white wins a pawn by queen takes pawn on d5. So black is trying to trade queens first, pawn takes. Now if black simply takes the pawn back, white's idea is to quickly develop, gaining time by attacking the pawn, and after, let's say, black protects the pawn, quickly play knight b5, threatening with a fork on c7 and attacking the pawn on a7 at the same time. That is why black played in this game, instead of pawn takes pawn, first trading the bishop for the knight on b1. The idea is that if white captures back, which is the obvious move, then pawn takes pawn. However, here came the big surprise. Pawn took pawn on c6. Now, if the knight takes back, rook takes bishop, white is a pawn ahead. If the bishop moves to some random square, pawn takes pawn, and the rook is trapped. So therefore, the most logical looking move is moving the bishop to e4. That protects the pawn on b7. And now comes a really amazing move. The natural looking c7 doesn't do much, because after the knight moves away from the attack, the rook guards the promotion square on c8. However, why don't you take a moment to think what's the right move here for white? It's a really brilliant move, and that is rook takes a7, giving up the rook. In a way, trapping the black rook, so black cannot do much but take on a7, and then c7. Amazingly, the pawn is unstoppable. It will become a queen next move. It's a really beautiful game. So let's go back to our other game where the queen went to c8. And we're continuing with white's fifth move.
C takes d5.
White took.
Black took back with c takes d5.
And that's a discovered attack on the white bishop on c1.
Knight to c3.
White develops, protects the bishop, and puts more pressure on the black pawn on d5.
Black responds with e6.
Black protects the pawn, opens up the bishop's diagonal.
Bishop to f4.
White continues developing. In this case, white also delays development on the king's side because hurries up to get the rook quickly into the game and passively start an attack quickly on the c file towards the c7 square.
a6.
Black is trying to prevent the knight from getting to b5, as I mentioned before, but this makes things even worse.
Knight to a4.
White right away points to the newly created weakness on b6. The threat is to play knight b6, forking the queen and rook.
Rook to a7.
That's a sad move. When one has to make such a move, it looks bad. And most moves in chess that look bad, they are bad. The problem is that black is kind of stuck. Because, for example, if the knight moves to d7, white right away would play rook to c1, chasing the queen away, and then the pawn on b7 will be hanging. That could be taken right away, and black loses at least a pawn. So after knight a4, black played rook a7,
Knight to b6.
chasing the queen.
Queen to d8.
The queen needs to hang on to the knight.
Bishop takes b8.
But yet, the bishop takes on b8. It would not be as good to play rook c1 first, to threaten to come down, because then the knight manages to develop and not let the rook through to c8. So white captured the knight.
Queen takes b8.
The natural response is to take back.
Now white plays queen to a4 check.
And here is the trouble. The king is under attack.
King e7.
King could not go to d8 because checkmate comes right away. King goes out to e7.
Now white plays rook to c1.
White brings another piece to the attack. The idea is threatening knight c8, rook c8, plenty of serious threats, besides the already existing queen d7.
g5.
This just prolongs the game a few more moves, but doesn't solve any of the problems. The problem was for black, instead of g5, the king could not escape because would move into a fork situation. And neither could the queen escape because it would move into a family fork. So black is really helpless.
Knight to e5.
And now white makes another improvement on the position, bringing yet another piece to the attack, threatening to give a check with the queen, king f6, and then checkmate with queen takes pawn on f7.
Black responds with knight to h6.
Obviously trying to protect the f7 pawn to avoid the previous variation I just showed.
And white continues with knight c8 check.
Well, this check is deadly, and black resigned, because if the king goes back to d8, again checkmate comes with queen d7, and if the king moves to f6, a fork comes with knight d7. What was black's mistake in this game? He seemingly did kind of the right thing, developing, controlling the center. However, as I said, it's more advisable to develop the king side first, to make sure the king gets in safety in time. In this game, black developed his queenside bishop, light squared bishop, early on, and the problem was it left the pawn on b7 weak, and that's what white jumped on right away and took advantage of.